Hello everyone, and welcome to my Ice Nova of Frostbolts Hierophant League Start Guide. If you're looking for a strong spellcaster to play this league, then look no further than the Archmage Hierophant. This is a build that scales its damage and defenses by stacking mana to the moon. We use the Archmage support gem to add a percentage of our unreserved mana as added lightning damage. We also pick up the Mind Over Matter Keystone passive that causes a portion of the damage we take to be taken from mana before life. These two mechanics combined with an endgame mana pool of almost 10,000 gives us the damage and defenses we need to breeze through T16s, T17s, and of course, Uber Pinnacle bosses. I've played this build twice in the last 3 months, and my god has it been a pleasure to play. Whereas most league starters fizzle upon reaching the endgame, the Archmage Hierophant starts off strong, stays strong, and gets faster, tankier, and deals more damage with each progressive upgrade. In this guide, I want to walk you through the build and gear progression. We'll start with the campaign, and I'll show you what you can expect from this build in white maps, yellow maps, red maps, and beyond. But before we get into gear progression, let's break down the details of what makes this build tick, and why it continues to be the most popular spell build for patch 3.25. We've already talked about the Archmage support gem. This is the meat and potatoes that lets us deal damage with this build. Its strength comes from its simplicity: stack more mana, deal more damage. With 9,000 unreserved mana, we are adding an average of 1,800 flat lightning damage to our spells. This damage on its own may seem unimpressive, but when you combine it with a skill that hits fast and hits multiple times with one cast, then we have a recipe for success. Enter Ice Nova of Frostbolts. This is a transfigured version of the Ice Nova spell that combos with Frostbolt. Here's what Ice Nova looks like on its own. You cast a spell and it deals area damage around your character. Now here's what Ice Nova of Frostbolt looks like. When you cast a spell, it expands out of up to 4 active Frostbolt projectiles to deal extra damage. So with one cast, we proc 4 Ice Novas, 8 if we are using the Spell Echo support gem. If Archmage is the payload that deals the damage, then think of Ice Nova of Frostbolts as the missile system that allows us to deliver the payload. The mechanic is absolutely cracked, and I would not be surprised to see it get unalived by GGG in patch 3.26. Now that we've talked about the bread and butter, let's have a look at some of the other offensive layers that help scale our damage. 2 of these layers come from the Hierophant Ascendancy. First, we have Transfiguration of Mind, which causes increases to mana to also apply to our damage at 30% of their value. This means that 300% increased mana gives us roundabout 90% increased damage. Nice. Second, we have Arcane Blessing, which gives us Arcane Surge, allowing us to cast faster, regenerate more mana, and deal more damage with our spells. Next up, we have Elemental Overload. This is a keystone passive that procs whenever you crit. The skill that crits gains a buff that deals 40% extra elemental damage for the next 8 seconds. Since we hit multiple times with each cast, our build will have an excellent uptime of this buff. Archmage does lightning damage. This means we also have access to the Shock mechanic, which makes enemies take more damage. Lightning Mastery causes increases to mana to also apply to our Shock effectiveness at 30% of their value. This means that 300% increased mana almost doubles the effectiveness of the shocks that we inflict. These are just some of the major ways in which we scale our damage. There's a lot more minutia like Frenzy Charges, Unnerve, Sigil of Power, Arcane Cloak, Intensify, and Curses that we'll cover later in the video. Just know that all of these layers compound to give us a build that can do things like this. Something else we've mentioned is the Mind Over Matter Keystone passive. This is the foundation of our defenses for this build. 40% of the damage you take is taken from mana before life. Divine Guidance from the Hierophant Ascendancy adds another 10%, meaning that half the damage we take is now redirected to our mana. But Mind Over Matter on its own isn't going to keep you breathing for long. The trick to being tanky in Path of Exile is combining defensive layers. Defenses don't just refer to your life, armor, or evasion. They also include, but are not limited to, Ailment Immunity, Curse Effectiveness, Stun Recovery, Block, Suppression, Leech, Recoup, Regeneration, the list goes on and on and on. Here's some of the defensive layers you can expect from the endgame setup of this build. And I think that's it. The only 2 things missing from this list is Curse Immunity and Crit Immunity, both of which can be obtained with enough investment into Mage Blood and Corrupted Implicit modifiers. The Archmage Hierophant is tanky. Don't believe me? Here's some clips of me eating mechanics that would one-shot most of my other builds. Alright, let's just tank everything. but not the slam, not the slam. Never the slam. So I'm just gonna stand here. Alright, you see that? My HP bar didn't even move. Hey, can we tank a meteor? I don't know, let's find out. Meteor, no problem. With that said, the build isn't immortal. We have no armor outside of a granite flask and limited ways to mitigate physical damage, so don't go crazy trying to tank Shaper Slams or anything like that. A lot of our survivability comes from being able to leech while dealing damage, so be careful of bosses and mechanics with immunity phase where our character cannot deal damage. With the build overview out of the way, let's get into the gear and character progression. I'm going to quickly go through the campaign and then spend the rest of the video walking you through gear upgrades for mapping. The build doesn't come alive until level 31. Up until this point, we're not playing an Archmage Hierophant, we're simply playing a Templar. I used Absolution on a 3-link with added fire damage and faster casting. I've seen others recommend rolling Magma on a 3-link with Combustion and Elemental Proliferation. Pick your poison and make your way towards the end of Act 3. At level 31, we can finish the Fixture of Fate quest and unlock the Archmage support. Throw away all the skills you've been using so far and pick up Firestorm, Archmage Intensify, and Inspiration. This requires a blue, 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 red 4-link setup. Firestorm drops meteors on your enemies. The first meteor of each cast is bigger and deals more damage. Archmage needs no introduction, but make sure that your mana is completely unreserved so that Archmage can work at full effectiveness. Intensify will give our spells increased area of effect. Consecutive casts without moving will decrease our area of effect but increase our area damage. Inspiration gives us charges which provide elemental damage and increased critical strike chance. More importantly, it lowers the cost of our skills, letting us easily sustain the mana cost of Archmage in the early game. At level 38, after killing Comb and Duresso, we unlock Cast When Damage Taken and Eternal Blessing. Eternal Blessing is a support gem that lets us use one aura and only one aura for free. I recommend using Determination to mitigate the spike in physical damage that comes with Act 5 and beyond. This requires a red-red 2-link setup. Cast When Damage Taken is a support that triggers spells when you've taken enough damage. We're going to link it to Arcane Cloak, which is a guard skill that turns your mana into a temporary barrier. A portion of the damage you take is absorbed by this barrier instead, and we also deal added lightning damage while the barrier is active. Arcane Cloak is mana hungry, so this lets us make good use of Arcane Surge support gem, which procs when a certain amount of mana is consumed. This requires a red-blue-blue 3-link setup. The last two skills we'll add are the Punishment, Curse, and the Sigil of Power skill. Punishment makes enemies take more damage when on low life. Enemies that hit you will also become debilitated, dealing less damage with subsequent hits. Sigil of Power is an auxiliary skill with a long cooldown. It creates a circular area that buffs you to deal more damage and debuffs enemies to deal less damage. The strength of the skill increases as you spend mana, so activate this when you encounter tough enemies. And that's it for the campaign skill gem progression. As for gear, I recommend that you have the following items. Get a heavy belt for strength, a jade amulet for dexterity, and make sure that you're upgrading your flasks. Stick to base items that provide spell damage, armor, and energy shield. 4 item modifiers, prioritize spell damage, mana, and cast speed on your weapons. Look for move speed on boots, and get as much life, mana, and resists where you can find them, making use of the hideout crafting bench where possible. This setup will take you all the way through the campaign and to the end of White Map progression. Then, we will transition into Ice Nova of Frostbolts. Here's some clips of what you can expect while playing this build through the campaign. Before we do mapping gear progression, let's have a look at the passive skill tree. We're going to start by taking as many damage nodes as possible. Path through damage and pick up Retribution. Then take Discipline and Training for life. Holy Dominion for resists and damage, and Light of Divinity for damage and critical chance. We can spend the next few points on Amplify for increased area of effect, and Precision for cast speed and dexterity. In Act 2, we're going to head away from the Templar and towards the Scion. Pick up Ash, Frost, and Storm for resists and elemental damage. Then, take Elemental Mastery, which gives you a 25% chance of inverting enemy resistances on hit. Inverted resists will make enemies take more damage instead of less damage. We're also going to take Shaper for regeneration. In Act 3, we'll head towards Constitution for life, and then travel to the Witch area to pick up Elemental Overload. This is our first Keystone passive. It's going to negate our critical strike damage multiplier and instead give us an 8-second elemental damage buff whenever we have a critical hit. We'll have swapped to Archmage by the end of Act 3, so we can now start incorporating mana into our build. Take Dreamer and Mana Mastery to reduce the mana cost of our skills. Finish Normal Lab and spend your first 2 points on Conviction of Power. I already explained this before, but it gives you Endurance charges, which reduce the damage you take, and Power charges that increases your critical strike chance. In Act 4, we'll grab Sentinel for some armor and resists. Then take Battle Ruse and Mana Mastery for 10% of damage taken recouped as mana. Recoup makes it so that you regenerate a portion of the damage you take over 4 seconds. Make sure to grab all the little nodes in this cluster because it's got really good efficiency. After getting mana recoup, we can now pick up Mind over Matter. This is our second Keystone passive, and it makes it so that a portion of the damage we take is redirected to our mana pool. With Archmage and Mind over Matter active, mana is now our primary method of scaling damage as well as survivability. That's what makes this build so good. In Act 5, we head away from the Scion and toward the Marauder to pick up Unwavering Stance. This is our third Keystone passive, and it makes it so that we can never be stunned. This build does not use evasion, so the Cannot Be Evade clause is a small price to pay to get that stun immunity. We go back to the Templar start area to get Sanctity for armor and regeneration, followed by Righteous Decree for increased mana and reduced mana cost of skills. In Act 6, we start by grabbing Asylum for Chaos Resists. Take Protection Mastery for damaging ailments cannot be inflicted on you while you already have one. This will help us to mitigate dangerous mechanics like Poison, which we are really vulnerable to because our Chaos resistance is low. Head back to the Witch area and pick up Mental Rapidity for cast speed, then take the Caster Mastery that gives your spells +1 to max stacks of intensity. In Act 7, take Arcanist's Dominion for damage and cast speed, then take Heart and Soul for increased life and mana. Complete Cruel Lab and spend your next 2 points on Divine Guidance for increased mana, damage taken from mana before life, as well as increased spell damage. In Act 8, take Cruel Preparations for life and resists, then take Deep Thoughts for increased mana and mana regeneration. Take Mana Mastery for a 10% chance to recover 10% of your mana when you use a skill. Archmage is mana hungry, and we welcome any mana sustain we can get our hands on. In Act 9, take Arcane Will for increased mana and flat mana regeneration, then take Prodigal Perfection for increased mana and damage. Remember to take the small node that gives flat mana because once again, this is a very efficient point. In Act 10, take Crackling Speed for lightning damage and cast speed. Take Lightning Mastery so that increases to mana apply to shock effect at a 30% value. We're going to wrap up the campaign by heading towards Light Eater for Energy Shield Leech. Take Leech Mastery to make sure that 10% of our Leech applies instantly. Complete Merciless Lab and spend your next 2 points on Sanctuary of Thought for less mana cost of skills, increased Energy Shield, and increased area of effect. Once you have this Ascendancy, you can go back to the Templar area and refund the points you spent on Amplify. You're not going to need that extra area of effect. You can also refund the early points you spent on damage and pat through these intelligence nodes instead. That's going to save you some points. When you start doing white maps, I suggest taking Prismatic Skin for increased maximum all resists. You can also take Protection Mastery so that your elemental resists can never be lowered by curses. This is a nice band-aid solution until we can get better gear that overcaps our resist. If your chest has no life modifier on it, then take the Life Mastery to give 15% increased life. Any points from here on out can be spent on taking Jewel Sockets or small life and mana nodes. Remember that this is an early game passive tree to help you get the build set up. So I'm not going to be suggesting any unique jewels, cluster jewels, or using any big brain tech or mechanics. For yellow maps, we're going to need to make some significant gear upgrades. Our stat priority hasn't changed, but stacking maximum mana is now more important than ever to ensure that our survivability and damage keeps up with the increasing difficulty of monsters. I've gone ahead and picked out some affordable uniques for us to use early into the game. Most of these items aren't strong or even ideal for an optimized endgame setup, but it is going to highlight the strengths and round out the weaknesses of the build. Most of these uniques are fairly common, so they should be easy to access unless you happen to be playing in SSF. The first item we'll buy is Moonsorrow. This is a wand that comes loaded with spell damage, lightning damage, and cast speed. The second item we'll purchase is Salfos Frame. This is a shield that provides spell damage, elemental resistances, spell block, and most importantly, maximum resistances. Once we get to yellow maps, enemy spell damage starts to become an issue. Stacking maximum resistances is one way of mitigating incoming spell damage. This is one of the cheapest ways to improve our survivability early in the game. Later on, we will switch to a more advanced form of mitigation like spell block or spell suppression. The downside of this item is that we lose our ability to block attack damage, but that's not too big of a deal since we didn't really have much to begin with. The third item we'll buy is Atziri's Foible. This is an amulet that provides a ton of mana and reduces the attribute requirements for your gems and items. Believe it or not, this is our best in slot, saving us points and affixes that would otherwise be spent on attributes instead. The fourth item we'll buy is Death Rush. This is an amethyst ring that gives us some much needed chaos resistance. More importantly, it also procs the adrenaline buff on kill. Make sure to get a copy of this ring that provides adrenaline for at least 3 seconds. Adrenaline gives you increased damage, increased speed, and reduced physical damage taken. If this ring is unavailable on LEAGUESTART, then consider using the Kikazaru Topaz ring instead. This ring gives us some resistances and a lot of life regen. The fifth item we'll purchase is Immortal Flesh. This is a leather belt that gives us a boatload of life and life regeneration. It comes with the downside of reducing your elemental resistances, but the life regeneration comes in clutch for mitigating damage over time effects. When buying this belt, look for rolls that maximize life regen and minimize the resistance penalty. The sixth and final item we'll purchase is Replica Comb's Heart. This is a chest that has no sockets, preventing us from using a 5 or 6 link socket setup. It makes up for this by providing us with a massive bonus to our flat mana instead. It also gives a modest amount of armor and lightning damage. Since this chest has no life modifiers, make sure to take the Life Mastery that gives you 15% increased life when you meet this condition. If this chest is unavailable on LEAGUESTART, then use a rare with life, mana, and resistances instead. If that happens to be a 5 link, then add lightning penetration to your setup. You'll notice that I've left the gloves, boots, and 1 ring slot open as flex options. Here I recommend that you use rare items with as much life, mana, resistances, and movement speed that you can find. Feel free to use whatever item you want in your helm slot, because we'll be replacing this with the unique item Kitava's Thirst once we switch into Ice Nova of Frostbolts. The last thing we can do is upgrade our flasks. I recommend using 2 Divine Life Flasks, 1 Divine Mana Flasks, and 1 Quicksilver and 1 Silver Flask. Enchant your utility flasks with the crafting bench using Instilling Orbs and Glassblower Bauble so that they activate when the charges reach full. We can also modify our life and mana flasks with alterations or beast crafting so that we have immunity to bleed, corrupting, blood, ignite, chill, and freeze. If you find yourself dying a lot, then you might want to consider swapping out the silver flask for a granite flask instead. Once you have these items, you should have enough damage and survivability to comfortably complete your Uber Lab. You now have 2 options. You can either keep progressing through yellow maps until you can afford Ice Nova of Frostbolts, or you can farm Uber Lab where you'll have the best chance of finding the gem yourself. Alright, so we're doing this part live. Once you have your Ice Nova of Frostbolts Transfigured Gem, you're going to need a 4-link blue setup. Okay, what you're going to do is take Ice Nova of Frostbolts, put that into your gloves like I have here, or any other 4 blue setup. Then you're going to use Archmage Support. This is our most important support gem. Then you're going to use the Spell Echo support. This is going to let you cast Ice Nova of Frostbolt multiple times without having to do the actual cast animation if you cast it on a Frostbolt. And you're going to put Lightning Penetration because now with the Archmage support, the majority of our damage is going to be from lightning. Alright, so here is our Ice Nova of Frostbolt setup. We'll put that on and you can see here that it costs 171 mana. Alright, this part is going to be really important when we put on Kitava's Thirst unique helmet. Alright, and you can see here that the gem is only level 2, so even with that said, we're doing 6,000 lightning damage per hit, and when it's leveled up, I think it'll be half and half for cold, half for lightning. Alright, the next most important thing you need to do is get yourself the Kitava's Thirst Zealot helmet. This is a couple of chaos depending on the role, The only thing we really care about on this unique is the 50% chance to trigger socketed spells when you spend at least 100 mana on a upfront skill. Okay, and we have that condition met with Ice Nova of Frostbolts. Okay, so you can see here that Ice Nova on Frostbolts on its own isn't really anything special to write home about, but if we put on Katava's Thirst, and then we take Frostbolt, greater multiple projectiles, returning projectiles, and then of course our Punishment Curse for a utility, we're gonna get something that looks like this. Alright, with this setup, let's take the build out for a spin, and of course whenever you get Frost Blink of Wintry Blast, you're gonna change that for a Frost Blink that you were using before, and you're going to attach it to Faster Casting and Archmage Support. The reason for this is it's going to give you a mobility skill that also costs 100 mana or more, so you're going to be proccing the Frostbolts and your Punishment Curse as you teleport around the map, alright? And that's going to set you up for your Ice Nova of Frostbolts. Okay, so let's take this build out for a spin. Here I have a Tier 16 Strand map. Okay, it's just got 4 mods on it, nothing impressive, and I can show you the atlas that I'm going to be testing this on. We have an end game atlas setup with Searing Exarch altars, and of course we have taken all of the map effect modifiers available on the tree. So you can see here that we have 62% increased effect of explicit modifiers on map. So this is your typical Alk and Go map setup for endgame. Right, we'll put this in. And you can see here that we are only level 77, and our gems are still unleveled, so there's a lot of room for improvement here, but I just want to take the build out for a spin and show you what it looks like. Alright, my apologies for the loot filter. I just did finish the campaign not too long ago. I haven't changed my filter yet. I'll put a... I don't have a portal. Well, we're just gonna YOLO it. If we die, we die. Hey, what the heck? There's 4 bosses. Alright, and there it is. Unfortunately, no portal scroll, so I'm going to have to log out here, but I'll see you guys in just a second. Alright, so as you guys saw in that previous clip, our gear setup is more than enough to get us through red map progression once we have Ice Nova of Frostbolts set up, even on a 4-link. To make your Atlas progression smoother, I'm going to give you some tips here that you can make to the current gear set you have. We don't have to make any major upgrades, we're just going to be doing Eldritch Implicits on our rare gloves and rare boots, right? The one major upgrade you will be making, though, is the glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel. I'll hover over that here real quick. This, you want to make sure you buy a version that is sacrificed in the name of Doriani. And the reason for this is because the glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel is going to give us access to the Corrupted Soul Keystone passive. So we're going to go to our passive tree here, and go over to the Witch area, and take these nodes leading up to this jewel socket. Right, once you have this jewel socket, you'll notice that when I place my glorious Vanity into this socket, that it's going to change all of the passives in this radius. All right, that includes the Deep Wisdom node here. So if you had that allocated and it is now bricked into something useless, make sure you unallocate it. Right, we don't care about these nodes, we're not min-maxing right now. The most important thing we care about is that the Pain Attunement node that used to be here has now changed to Corrupted Soul. So, if you read this, it says 50% of your damage taken bypasses Energy Shield, and gain 15% of your maximum life as extra maximum Energy Shield. Let's go ahead and allocate this. We go from 2000 ES to 2700 ES. Alright, but the Energy Shield bonus is not the main reason we are using this jewel. Instead, we're using it for the 50% of the damage taken bypasses your energy shield. Now, I know that seems a little counterintuitive. Why would you invest into a shield where half of the damage bypasses it anyways? Alright, the reason we want this is because if you look at Mind Over Matter, it says very precisely that only 40% of the damage you take from your life is redirected to your mana. That means that the damage we take to our energy shield is not being affected by our mana pool or by Mind Over Matter. Right, so we're losing a bunch of defensive layers by this never being active. When we take Corrupted Soul, right, half of the damage is going to go to your shield, the other half is going to go to your life. And from the half that goes to your life, half of it will go to your mana. So we are splitting the damage we take in 3 different ways, and I know that doesn't sound like it's doing a lot, but this is the secret sauce that makes this build tanky. Because you're going to have so much life leech, so much energy shield leech, and so much mana recuperation and regeneration that all the damage you take to those 3 different pools is going to be topped up as you continue to cast your Ice Nova of Frostbolts. Right? This one upgrade made my build feel so tanky, and for those of you struggling with survivability early into the red maps, try out this jewel, you will thank me later. With the jewel out of the way, let's look at our Eldritch Implicits. I've gotten a pair of gloves and boots here to demonstrate because I already have these implicits rolled onto my rare items, and I don't want to brick them just for a demonstration. So, if I press Alt on my rare gloves here, you'll notice that the blue Ichors is giving me lightning damage leached as life, and the red Embers are giving me chance to unnerve enemies on hit. Alright, Unnerve is going to increase the spell damage your enemies take, and because Ice Nova hits so many times and so fast, you don't need a high percentage chance to proc Unnerve. Alright, 15% will more than suffice. So let's go ahead and get these on our gloves. Okay, so there is the lightning damage leech as life. We ended up spending quite a few Ichors to do this, so you might just get unlucky. I ended up rolling fire, chaos, cold, leech instead. That's fine. Now let's do the same with the Eldritch Embers and get Unnerve. Alright, and that one we got lucky. We got it in 4 Embers. So that is your chance to unnerve enemies for 4 seconds on hit, as well as your lightning damage leech as life. And the lightning damage here is the most important implicit, guys, so get that if you can't afford anything else. And that's because once you get Corrupted Soul, you're going to want life regeneration and life leech to make up for the 50% of the damage that is now going through your shield, okay? So it is a balancing act of you taking damage and leeching it back. For our boots, we are going to be looking for action speed on the red embers, so let's go ahead and get that. Alright, so there is our increased action speed implicit on the boots. Alright, this is a more multiplier on the speed bonuses for your character. Alright, and for the blue Ichors, we are going to try to get regenerate life based on how much endurance charges you have. So let's see if we can do that. Alright, and there it is, regenerate 0.2% of life per second per endurance charge. And since we have 4 endurance charges, that's almost round about 1% life regenerated. Alright, so there is our Eldritch Implicits for our gloves and our boots. The last thing we can do is we can put an anoint on our amulet. So I actually don't have the oils for this, I'm going to go get that real quick. Okay, so I've gotten the oils, you're going to go to Sister Cassia, and you're going to go to Anoint Items. Here you'll put in your Ed Series Foible, and the anointment I recommend for you at this point in the game is Mind Drinker, so that is 1 verdant oil and 2 teal oils. And Mind Drinker is going to give us 20% increased maximum mana, and it's going to give us recover 2% of mana on kill. This isn't a end game anoint, but it's really useful for mapping because we're going to be killing a lot of monsters, and that's going to keep our mana topped up. So go ahead and get the Mind Drinker anoint. And there you go, those are the upgrades we are going to make for the build. Alright, now is a good time for us to talk about Pantheons. We're going to be using Soul of the Brine King. We want to upgrade this so we get a chance to avoid being frozen. This will carry us until we can get ailment immunity later on in the build. And then for your minor Pantheon, you're going to want to use Soul of Abereth. And you're going to want to upgrade it so that you are unaffected by Burning Ground. Remember that this build is weakest to damage over time and physical damage. So Burning Ground is a damage over time effect. Mitigating that with the Soul of Aberth will be really nice for our build. Hey, this is enough for you to do your 2 Watchstones, to finish all of your red maps, and to start doing a very easy mapping strategy. If you want to do more difficult strategies and get our last 2 Watchstones, then we have a lot of upgrades to make, and the next section of this video is going to cover exactly that, so I'll see you shortly. Alright, so the first major upgrade we're going to make for our build is a new wand. Up until this point, we've been using the Moon Sorrow Imbued Wand. It's done us well, but it's not going to cut it anymore. Right? We are going to need a rare item with cast speed, spell damage, and most importantly, maximum mana. So go ahead and buy yourself a eye level 86 Profane Wand, and then go to Faustus, and here we're going to buy some Deafening Essences of Woe. This is a essence that guarantees the increased spell damage modifier when you use it to craft an item. I'm gonna go ahead and buy one for a Divine here, and we're gonna start spamming these essences onto our wand until we get a high maximum mana roll. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, that didn't take long. We ended up with a maximum mana tier 3 roll, so that's 123 mana, but we do have a small problem here, right? Because we have 3 suffixes, and none of those suffixes are useful for our build. All we have are useful prefixes on this wand. If you end up in a situation like this, you might have to try and annul. So I'm going to go ahead and get some Orb of Annulments from my stash, and our goal here is to get rid of 1 suffix. So let's go ahead and try that. Okay, it got rid of the maximum mana. So if that happens, you have to start with the essence crafting again. So let's go ahead and get back to essence spamming. Alright, so this is a nice wand that we hit. It's a little bit misleading, and that's because we have a spell damage mod, a spell damage maximum mana hybrid mod, and a lower tier maximum mana mod. But all of those stats combined still gets us to above 100 mana and above 100 spell damage, which is what we wanted out of this wand. And we have open suffixes, so we can use the crafting bench to put cast speed on our wand. So let's go ahead and put some cast speed on here. Alright, 1 Exalted Orb for the highest tier of cast speed. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And there you go. That is your wand upgrade from Moon Sorrow. And I guess one more thing you can do for the wand before you equip it is you can go to the runesmithing table here, and you can put the wand in and type in spell damage and get the highest spell damage enchant that you can afford. So for me, that happens to be 20 to 29 increased spell damage, but the 30 to 39 isn't all that expensive either. Alright, you just need 45 life runes. And there you go. There is your wand upgrade from Moon Sorrow. So let's go ahead and put this on. So after finishing our wand upgrade, the next most important thing for us to change is our chestplate. Up until this point, you've been using Replica Comb's Heart, or a rare chest piece equivalent. We're going to want to switch into our best in slot for this build, which is the Cloak of Defiance Licord Garb. So let's go ahead and remove the Replica Comb's Heart and put in the Cloak of Defiance. Alright, ideally this will be a 6-link when you switch from Comb's Heart. You'll notice immediately that our mana has dropped by over 1,000. But Cloak of Defiance makes up for it because it's going to save us a lot of points. Alright, you'll notice here on this chestplate that it gives you the Mind Over Matter keystone. We have Mind Over Matter allocated on our passive skill tree. Because we have Mind Over Matter from our chest, we no longer need it on our passive tree. That means we can move our Glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel from this little jewel setup all the way over here, and that's going to save us a bunch of points. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to unequip this jewel, and then I'm going to put a point into this jewel socket, and then you'll notice that when I put in Glorious Vanity, it's going to transform all of these nodes instead. It's worth checking to see that none of these nodes have been bricked, because if they have, you might want to try a different pathing route. And also, you might want to start looking at the number that is on this jewel, because that's going to determine what these small passive change into. So for this one, 5186, I ended up getting some spell suppression, I ended up getting spell damage, and some spell damage and crit for this big node over here. Okay, but most importantly, our Mind Over Matter that used to be here is now being turned into Corrupted Soul, but Cloak of Defiance gives us Mind Over Matter anyways, so we are A-okay. With this setup, you no longer need these points in this side of the tree, so let's go ahead and unallocate all of these nodes, and you can also slot back your Deep Wisdom for some extra mana if you desire. Right, that saves us a bunch of points, but it also gives us a different type of problem. And that problem is our build is no longer compatible with Unwavering Stance. Cloak of Defiance is a evasion chess piece. It gives you a ton of evasion. Alright, you do not want to be wasting this evasion, so we can no longer use Unwavering Stance, which prevents us from evading enemy attacks. This means that we lose our stun immunity, but don't worry, I have a solution for that. Take the point out of Unwavering Stance, and then get this basic jewel socket node here instead. Then, we're gonna go and get the Immutable Force unique jewel. Right, this might be a little costly on League Start, I'm not sure. I ended up buying mine later on into the league, and this one cost me around 3 divines. So let's have a look at this jewel. It rolls all the way from 500 to 1000% increased stun and block recovery. The maximum threshold for your stun recovery is 961%. So, you can either spend the money and get a jewel that has 961% or higher, or you can get 931% and then get 30% from your upgraded Soul of the Brine King Pantheon. Add those two together and you will have 961%, which is the breakpoint we require to get roundabout stun immunity. Go ahead and put this jewel in this jewel socket over here, and check your defenses to make sure that your block and stun recovery modifier is above 961. Alright, with this setup, you will not feel the effects of stuns whenever your character is stunned, and that's because your recovery is so high. So we get the stun immunity without having to sacrifice our chance to evade enemy attacks. So now we also have evasion as a major defensive layer of our build. Once you have your 6 links slotted in, goal is to upgrade our gems. We're going to make sure that all of them have level 20 and 20% quality. Alright, the only awakened skill gem you need for this build is Awakened Lightning Penetration, so go ahead and buy yourself one of those gems and start leveling it, and you do not need Awakened Spell Echo. Alright, you might see this on other people's POBs, on PoE Ninja. It doesn't work the way you think it would with Ice Nova of Frostbolts, so just use a regular Spell Echo instead and save yourself the money. And for those of you that need a recap on the support gems you are using, this is Ice Nova of Frostbolts, connected to Archmage, connected to Intensify, Spell Echo, Awakened Lightning Penetration, and Inspiration Support. Alright, in the order of most important to least important. Alright, the next most important upgrades for our build are going to be 2 jewels. That is the Unnatural Instinct Viridian Jewel and the Light of Meaning Prismatic Jewel. So let's open up our passive skill tree and I'll show you where to slot these jewels in. For Unnatural Instinct, we're going to go to the Scion Start area. You're going to pick up these life regeneration nodes, and then you're going to take the basic jewel socket here. Then you're going to put in Unnatural Instinct. Alright, let's talk about what Unnatural Instinct does. It's going to make it so that allocated small passive skills in the radius grant nothing. So you'll notice that this Intelligence node, the Strength node, and these life regeneration nodes now grant me nothing. Alright, instead, we're going to get all of the unallocated nodes applied to our build. So if you hover over this jewel, it'll show you exactly what you're getting from this little circle. So we're getting spell damage, cast speed, life, maximum mana, area of effect, strength, intelligence, so on and so forth. Alright, this is a very good bang for your buck jewel, and it's worth the money that it costs. So go ahead and get this as your next jewel upgrade. Once you have Unnatural Instinct socketed, we're going to go down to the Scion area over here. We're going to get these resistance nodes, and then we're going to get the basic jewel socket over here. Right, you have 2 options for this jewel socket. So one, you can get a Light of Meaning that gives you Chaos Resistance. This is going to make it easier for you to gear your character because you don't have to worry about Chaos Resist with this jewel. Right, this jewel can also be expensive. I ended up paying 9 divines for it, and that might be a lot of currency for you on League Start. Right, a cheaper alternative is the jewel that grants you mana instead. This means that you'll have to rely on your gears to solve your Chaos Resistance, okay? So let's see what happens to our mana if we put it here. I'll socket it in, and you'll notice that you get a big circle here. All the nodes that you have active in this circle is now giving you mana. And that changes our mana pool from 6,600 to 7,400. And that's going to increase as you continue to fill out some of these nodes. Alright, for my build, I ended up going with the Chaos Resistance. That way I didn't have to get Chaos Resistance on my Spell Suppression gear later. So that is what I ended up using. I'll leave it up to you as to whether or not you want to get Chaos Resist or mana in this node. Right, and the cool thing here is that you see this little Venn diagram section. Unnatural Instinct, all of these nodes that we have applied to our build, is also giving us the bonus from the Light of Meaning. So you'll notice here that I'm getting Chaos Resist and Cast Speed, getting Area of Effect and Chaos Resist, and so on and so forth. So that are these two jewels over here. Okay, with our jewel socketed in, our focus now shifts towards jewelry. Up to this point, we've been using Amethyst Ring Base with Death Rush and the Immortal Flesh Unique Belt. Alright, these have been good for Atlas progression, but they're going to kind of suck whenever you're doing endgame strats. We want to switch into a Stygian Vise for our belt, a ring with a lot of resistances, some dexterity, life, and mana, and then, if you're resistance capped, you can swap into the Anathema Moonstone Ring. Alright, so let's put these on, and then I'll talk you through what the Anathema Ring does. Alright, so having a look at Anathema, you'll see that it gives you a little bit of cast speed. The most important thing about this ring is that it gives you your curse limit is equal to your maximum power charges. On this build, we have a maximum of 4 power charges. That means we can use 4 curses on the enemy using Anathema. Right, this means that we get a major damage upgrade for our character. Alright, we're going to set up Arcanist Brand, and a bunch of curses connected to Arcanist Brand. So for those of you that don't know what Arcanist Brand is, it's a skill that you can cast, and it's going to attach itself to nearby enemies, and then cast whatever skills you have equipped to it. So I'm going to go to the ledge here to demonstrate. Right, we're going to have a Arcanist Brand that's connected to nothing. You'll see it connect, and then it's just going to cast nothing because we haven't put any spells in it. Now, if I go ahead and put Enfeeble onto Arcanist Brand, I'll cast it. And you'll notice that it is now casting Enfeeble on these enemies. Alright, if I go ahead and put on my other curses, so Conductivity and Elemental Weakness, and then I put Arcanist Brand, you'll notice that it is rotating those curses. Alright, so it is now affecting the enemies with Enfeeble, Elemental Weakness, Conductivity, and then we'll be getting Punishment as our 4th curse from Katava's Thirst. So use this Arcanist Brand setup whenever you're fighting the map boss, or you're doing some kind of bossing, or just a very tanky rare monster. Right? The minus resistances you get from the curses is going to give you a 50% increase to your damage. It's actually pretty crazy, guys. Alright, the other important thing to do now that we have our Stygian Vise, this is where we're going to get our Corrupted Blood immunity. So I have an Abyssal Jewel here with the implicit Corrupted Blood cannot be inflicted on you. That is the most important thing you're looking for. If you can find a rare Abyss Jewel with relevant stats like Dexterity, Maximum Life, Maximum Mana, then more power to you. I've also gotten a percentage chance to gain phasing on this jewel, so I'm going to slot that into my belt. And now our build has phasing, and it can no longer be inflicted with Corrupted Blood. Very nice. Alright, with our jewelry complete, our next big goal is to get our build to swap from Sapphil's Frame into Spell Suppression. Since most of our items are locked in either to uniques or items that cannot roll Spell Suppression, the only slots we have left remaining is our gloves and our boots. So you're going to want to try and load as many Spell Suppression modifiers onto these gloves and boots that you can. Alright, my recommendation is to buy this made from another player, or to buy a fractured base and craft it yourself. If you decide to go with the crafting route, for the boots, I ended up using the Deafening Essences of Loathing. Let me just find that for you here real quick. So this is Deafening Essence of Loathing. You can see that when it's applied to boots, it guarantees the chance to avoid Elemental Ailments modifier. Alright, you're going to want that alongside a high tier affix that is relevant to your build. In this case, I settled for Maximum Life, and then you're going to fill out the remaining modifiers with movement speed, mana, or anything else you think your build requires. Alright, that could be resistances. So that's how I made this pair of boots. The more important thing with these boots is the Eldritch Implicits. You're going to be using the red embers to get increased action speed, and you're going to be using the blue ichors to get chance to avoid elemental ailments. If you do this correctly, this pair of boots is going to give you at least 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments. And once we have completely swapped into Spell Suppression, we're going to equip the Ancestral Vision unique jewel, and that's going to make 50% of our Spell Suppression apply to avoid elemental ailments as well. So you're going to get 50% from Ancestral Vision and 50% from your boots, and that is how we get ailment immunity on this build. So I'm going to go ahead and put this pair of boots on. Right, and for your gloves, I'm going to recommend that you keep it simple to start. Buy a pair with high suppression chance, some life, and some resistances from somebody. Right, and later, as the league goes on, people are going to start recombinating pairs of gloves so that they can get this special modifier on it. Right, if you look at the bottom there, the suffix modifier of Puharte, you're going to see that it gives you cold resistance as well as increased damage with hits against chilled enemies. This is something that you're probably not going to see in League Start, but you're going to see it very quickly as people start recombinating items. Right? They're going to recombinate Temple Affix gloves onto gloves that have spell suppression, and you're going to get something that looks like this. Right? I don't know how to recombinate this myself, so I cannot give you instructions on how to make this item, so I just bought mine. I recommend that you do the same. But what I can tell you though is that we can change the Eldritch Implicits from lightning damage leached as life to chance to suppress spell damage. And of course this is the blue Eldritch Ichors. In order to make the swap, you first need to get a corrupted version of Kitava's Thirst that has percentage of lightning damage leached as life. Once you have this, you can remove the Lightning Leech Eldritch Implicit off of your gloves and replace it with chance to suppress spell damage instead. And that will make it so that your build is less reliant on these passives over here to cap your spell suppression. Alright, so let's go ahead and put this on. Right, now that we are swapping into spell suppression, we can start dropping some of these maximum resistance nodes. So let's take these off, and you're going to put them into the spell suppression nodes over here instead. Alright, and how many of these little nodes you need is going to depend on how good your gear is and how close you are to capping spell suppression without those nodes. So if we take a look at my build over here, I have 78% chance to suppress spell damage with this setup, so I'll need to find some more spell suppression elsewhere. One way of doing this is to change your anointment on your Etziri's Foible. So here you can see that I've anointed Inveterate. This is going to give us 15% chance to suppress spell damage. So let me just go ahead and put that on. And now you'll see that my build is sitting at 93% spell suppression. And then, of course, I forgot to take Magebane over here. That makes it so Dexterity gives you a percentage chance to suppress spell damage. So let's take this, and you'll see that our build is now suppression capped. Right, and once you're suppression capped, you can slot in your Ancestral Vision. So I'll put this jewel socket over here, put Ancestral Vision in, and you'll notice that we are now completely ailment immune. So that is a lot of benefits we get from speccing into spell suppression. Alright, most importantly, with spell suppression active, you can now afford to remove your Sapphil's Frame. We no longer need the maximum resistances from this shield. Instead, you're going to find another wand, just like the one you have here, and then you're going to be a dual wield wand setup. Alright, so here I have an example of a wand I crafted during progression. It has a Fractured Mana mod on it, but the stats are very similar. It has above 100 mana, around 100% spell damage, and then some mastercrafted cast speed. So I'll go ahead and put this on, and there you go. This is what our build looks like with this setup. Alright, the last thing to mention is that when you have this much mana and gear, you don't need a mana flask any longer, so go ahead and swap it out for a jade flask or a granite flask. My endgame flask setup uses a silver flask, a quicksilver flask, a granite flask, and a jade flask. Alright, and for the affixes, we're going to stick with evasion on the jade, armor on the granite, move speed on the quicksilver, and spell damage leeches life on the silver flask. Alright, the last thing we can do once we have our dual wield wand is change our gems around a little. So at this point, you should have Arcane Cloak on a automation setup. We have more than enough mana and mana regeneration to have this automated instead of cast when damage taken. So I'm going to go ahead and put automation, Arcane Cloak, and more duration. Alright, the reason we're using more duration is because we want to lower the frequency in which we spend mana for Arcane Cloak. Alright, without more duration, you're constantly going to be using Arcane Cloak on automation, and you're going to be at a mana deficit. Alright, we don't want that. We want enough time for our mana to recover after Arcane Cloak proc, so that's why I'm using more duration. And then for our cast when damage taken support, we are now using Frost Shield and Sigil of Power. Alright, Frost Shield is new to the build. This is going to put down a bubble whenever you take enough damage, and that bubble is going to drain your energy shield. It's going to give you a barrier, and that barrier is going to absorb damage from enemy hits. Alright, because we have so much energy shield leech, the drain from this ability is negligible. That is just a pure defensive bonus for this build. And that's it for the gear progression section of this video. If you're looking to further invest into the build to get crazy expensive upgrades, then I can show you some of the gear I had from my Mageblood setup. So the first thing I did was change my wands. So you can see that these wands have been crafted in the same way that I crafted the ones that we have now, except I used a fractured base. The fractured modifier here is the increased spell damage and maximum mana roll. The higher that roll is, the more expensive the base will be. Alright, for example, this is a 10 divine base, and this was a 30 divine base. I used the essences to craft spell damage and maximum mana onto it, and then I multi-modded it for a chance to deal double damage and give us increased cast speed. Probably the most expensive part of this wand is the enchantment, Haunted by Tormented Spirits. This is an enchant that is exclusive to the Settlers of Kalgor League, and with it active, you get 35% increased damage, 35% increased cast speed, and 35% increased move speed. And of course, if you put that on both your wands, they stack. For our amulet, we can look for a double corrupted at series foible. Here's an example of one that gives me +1 to all maximum resistances. Alright, you can also use catalysts, I believe they are called fertile catalysts, to get even more mana from your at series foible. For our ring, we ended up going with an offensive setup. This is a Crusader influenced ring, and it is giving us spell damage, cast speed, life, and then I multi-modded some frenzy charge and mana modifiers onto it. And if you have some points to spend, you can get this cluster socket over here, 1, 2, 3, and you can find where you can remove points to get a Megalomaniac setup. Alright, so for the Megalomaniac mods, we have Arcane Heroism, this gives us increased effective Arcane Surge, and we have Mindfulness, which gives us increased maximum mana and increased maximum mana regeneration. Alright, this is a 2-mod Megalomaniac. You can try and spend more money to get a third relevant mod here as well. And then of course we have the Mageblood setup. This is roughly 200 divines when I bought it, and then we have the Mageblood Flasks to go alongside it. With a Mageblood, you're going to be a lot faster, you're going to be stun immune without Immutable Force, so that frees up one of your jewel sockets. You're going to have permanent phasing, and you're going to have a lot of armor from the Granite Flask that is always active. The Bismuth Flask also solves all of your resistance problems, so you can have more offensive affixes on your items, like this ring I have here, or this increased damage during any flask effect modifier on these gloves. And that's it for the gear progression section of this video. That brings us to the end, but don't leave just yet, because if you want to see what this build looks like from start to finish, I recommend checking out my 0 to Hero series. I'm going to post a thumbnail of the video on the screen right now, and there is going to be a link in the description below if you want to watch the whole series. In that video, I start this character from scratch with nothing, and we get all of these upgrades you see here, including the Mageblood, and we do 40 out of 40 challenges. So with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a fun time with the Necropolis Settlers of Kalgor League that is starting on November 7th, and I will see you soon with a new video.